The Yoon family spoke Korean at the dinner table specifically, so she would not understand. Zara had figured this out at their third family dinner 2 years ago, when her mother-in-law, a woman who could make the word welcome sound like a warning, had complimented the galbi and then, in the same smooth breath, told her son that the girl has no breeding, no grace, and no business sitting at this table. His aunt had nodded, mouth curved in that particular smile Korean drama villains wore right before they burned everything down. His father had said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Zara had reached for more rice. She had smiled. Tonight was the same dinner in a different month. The dining room of the Yoon family estate was exactly as it always was. Rosewood table lacquered to a mirror shine, low lighting that made everyone look like they belonged in a painting, the faint smell of chrysanthemum tea and disapproval. Zara sat in her usual seat, third from the end, close enough to feel included, far enough to be reminded that she was not. Her husband, Junho Yoon, sat at her left. He was handsome in that particular way that made strangers stop mid-sentence, sharp jaw, dark eyes that gave nothing away, the kind of stillness that read as calm until you understood it was control. He was the sort of man who filled a room without trying, who made hospitals quieter when he walked through them. As chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Yoon Medical Center, he operated with hands that never shook and a voice that never rose. Tonight, those hands were perfectly still around his chopsticks. His eyes were fixed on his bowl. Zara was also a surgeon. Emergency medicine. She worked 12-hour shifts in a different wing of the same hospital, pulling bullets and resetting cracked sternums and bringing people back from edges most families never knew existed. She was the best in her department. Her colleagues knew it. Her residents worshipped her. Her patients lived. The Yoon family did not care. His mother, Yoon Miwa, spoke first. She always did. Her voice was the texture of silk, smooth on the surface, cold underneath. "The jjigae is good tonight," she said in Korean. Soyeon outdid herself. Zara had noticed years ago that compliments in this family always had a second sentence. Tonight was no different. "You should learn to cook like this," Mihwa continued. "A wife who cannot feed her husband's family is a wife who is not trying." Junho did not look up. Zara watched him not look up. She had become an expert in reading his silence over 2 years of marriage. She could tell the difference between the silence that meant he was thinking, the silence that meant he was tired, and the silence that meant he heard everything, and had decided the cost of responding was more than he was willing to pay tonight. This was the third kind. His aunt Seo Yeonhee, a retired professor with a talent for cruelty that she dressed in academic language, leaned in, voice dropping to that register that suggested confidence. That register that said no one important was listening. "Has Junho spoken to the Lim family yet?" Yeonhee asked, eyes cutting sideways toward Miwa. Suyeon's parents called again. "They are still open to the conversation. They are patient people. But even patient people have limits." The name settled over the table like smoke. Lim Suyeon, 29, Korean, the daughter of a prominent Seoul family. A name Zara had heard whispered in this house like a prayer, like a correction, like everything she was not. Mihwa set down her spoon with the deliberateness of a woman who had already made a decision and was only now announcing it. "The situation cannot continue indefinitely," she said. "Junho knows what is expected of him. He has known since before this marriage was made. There are responsibilities to this family. There is a legacy, a name. She does not carry it, not in the way that matters. She, not Zara, never Zara. In this house, Zara had no name. She was she, her, the wife, a placeholder noun for something the family had not yet found the courage to fully dispose of." Junho's chopsticks were very still. Zara had operated on a man last Tuesday whose aorta had torn clean through at 3 in the morning. She had held it together with her hands for 40 minutes while her team worked around her, calm as weather, steady as stone. She had felt his pulse under her fingers like a question she was answering in real time. She thought about that now. She thought about what it meant to hold something broken and not let it fall. Yeonhee continued, warming to the subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to say this for months. "Suyeon is a good match, a real match. Same culture, same values, same understanding of what the Yoon name requires. She has been educated, well-traveled, accomplished. She would be an asset to this family, not a— She paused. An experiment, Mihua finished, smoothly, quietly, with the precision of a woman who knew exactly how sharp her words were and chose them accordingly. The table was very quiet. Junho's father had not spoken since they sat down. He was a man of carved stone economy. He moved money, moved people, moved circumstances, and considered words beneath him when actions were available. He nodded now, once, barely visible. The kind of nod that closed a room. Zara watched her husband. She watched him receive his father's nod, watched his jaw tighten by a single, almost imperceptible degree, watched the stillness in him take on a different quality, less patience, more burial. He knew. He had always known. And he said nothing. Zara lifted her teacup, took a slow, careful sip, set it back down with both hands, the way she had been taught to do in this house, with deference, with quietness, with all the careful performance of a woman who did not understand what was happening around her. She looked at her mother-in-law. She looked at the woman who had called her an experiment at her own dinner table, in a language she had chosen precisely because she was certain Zara would not understand. Then Zara spoke. In Korean? The jjigae is wonderful, Yeomianim. Did you use your grandmother's recipe, or did you reduce the gochugaru this time? I always think the broth runs lighter in autumn. Something about the way the dried anchovies steep differently when the air is cold. She asked it the way she asked questions in the OR, measured, focused, already knowing the answer. The dining room did not move. Mihua's teacup was halfway to her lips. It stayed there. The aunt Seo Yeonhee, retired professor, architect of cruelty, had gone the particular shade of stillness that came before a system rebooted. The father's face had not changed at all, which was somehow the most alarming thing in the room. And Junho had finally looked up. He was looking at her now, directly, fully, the way he almost never looked at her in this house. His dark eyes were unreadable in the way that meant he was reading everything, processing, calculating the distance between what he knew and what he had just understood. Zara looked back at him. She held his gaze the way she held bleeding vessels, firm, steady, giving nothing away. Then she picked up her chopsticks, took a bite, and the table stayed frozen around her, every person in it recalculating everything they thought they knew while Zara ate her dinner in absolute silence, in a room that had just realized it had never actually been alone. Nobody spoke for the rest of dinner. Not Mihua, who had set her teacup down so carefully it barely touched the saucer. Not Yeonhee, whose mouth had opened and then closed again like a woman who had reached for a weapon and found an empty holster. Not Junho's father, who had looked at Zara for exactly 3 seconds, the longest he had ever looked at her, before returning to his food with the expression of a man updating an internal file. And not Junho. Junho had looked at her for the rest of the meal with the focused, unreadable attention he usually reserved for surgical complications. The kind of look that meant he was not going to stop until he understood exactly what he was dealing with. Zara let him look. She finished her rice. She accepted more tea when Soyeon refilled the pot. She commented on the banchan in Korean, just briefly, just enough telling Mihua that the japchae was particularly good tonight, that the glass noodles had exactly the right pull to them. Mihua said nothing. The compliment landed in the silence like a stone in deep water, and Zara watched the ripples move across the older woman's face before the surface went smooth again. Control, Zara thought. That was the only language this family truly spoke. She had spent 2 years learning it. The car back to the main house was silent. Junho sat beside her in the back seat, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, far enough that nothing touched. The driver kept his eyes forward. The city moved past the windows in long, slow strokes of light. When they were inside, when the door had closed behind them and the house staff had retreated to their quarters, Junho stopped in the entrance hall. He did not turn around. "How long?" he said. His voice was very quiet. The kind of quiet that in an operating theater meant something had gone wrong and he needed the room to hear him clearly. Zara set her bag on the console table, took off her earrings, set them down one at a time. "How long have you spoken Korean, Zara?" It was not a question. He had already worked out that it was not a question. She turned. "Long enough," she said. He turned, too. He looked at her the way she imagined he had looked at the first chest he ever opened, like the thing in front of him was both exactly what he expected and nothing like what he was prepared for. You understood. He said it almost to himself. Every dinner. Yes. The word was soft. It held everything. He exhaled. It was not quite a sound. It was more like a pressure releasing from somewhere deep, the structural equivalent of a wall admitting it had been load-bearing all along. He crossed the entrance hall slowly and stopped in front of her. Closer than he usually stood in this house, where even their private spaces had developed a careful, negotiated distance. She could see the fine tension in his jaw, could see the thing behind his eyes that he had kept behind his eyes for 2 years, the awareness, the guilt, the calculation of a man who had understood exactly what was happening and had told himself a story about why staying silent was something other than a choice. Zara, he started. She held up one hand. Not tonight, she said. He stopped. She picked her earrings back up off the console table. She walked past him toward the stairs. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel him standing there in the entrance hall, and she knew with the same bone-deep certainty she felt when a patient's vitals shifted in a direction that could not be ignored, that something had broken open tonight that neither of them would be able to close. Again, that was fine. She had been waiting 2 years for something to break open. Union Medical Center had 17 floors and 412 beds, and exactly one corridor where the cardiothoracic wing and the emergency department shared a stretch of wall. Zara had learned to time her coffee breaks around it. Not to avoid Junho, their marriage was complicated, but they were professionals, and the hospital had its own rules that held even when everything else was fraying. She timed her breaks around that corridor because it was the one place in the building where she could hear the cardiothoracic ward's family lounge from the emergency stairwell, and Mihua visited that lounge every Thursday morning. She had been doing this for 7 months. It had started by accident. She had been in the stairwell on a Thursday. 6 minutes into a break she had not slept enough to properly enjoy, when she heard Mihua's voice carrying through the ventilation gap above the fire door. Mihua had been on the phone. She had been talking about the Lim family. She had been talking about timelines. Zara had stood very still in the stairwell and listened. She had gone back every Thursday since. Today was Thursday. She pushed through the stairwell door at 8:47, coffee in hand, and positioned herself in the alcove below the vent. The lounge was already occupied. She could hear Mihua's voice, and another she recognized after a moment as Yeonhee, which meant today was not a phone call. Today was a meeting. Today was something more deliberate. The Lim family has agreed to move the conversation forward, Mihua was saying. Suyeon's father wants a formal dinner, a proper introduction, not a social occasion, a declaration of intent. Good, said Yeonhee. And Junho? A pause. The kind that meant the answer was complicated. Junho will do what is necessary, Mihua said. He has always understood his obligations. The current arrangement is not, she paused again, it is not what this family needs. She is competent, she is not wrong, but she is not what this family built itself for. The Yoon name requires a particular kind of partnership, one that carries something forward. And if he resists? Yeonhee asked. He will not, Mihua said, because he knows. Whatever he feels, and I have no interest in what he feels, he knows the difference between sentiment and responsibility. He married her knowing this day would come. We were all patient, we gave them time. But the Lim family will not wait past the new year, and I will not ask them to. This concludes before December. Zara took a slow sip of her coffee. December. She did the math without meaning to. 6 weeks. 6 weeks before his mother expected the marriage to be dissolved, the Lim family satisfied, and Lim Soo-yeon installed in the place Zara had occupied for 2 years. She thought about the entrance hall last night, about Junho standing very still while she walked past him up the stairs, about the look on his face, not the look of a man who did not care. The look of a man who had cared for a long time and had made a decision, and then kept making that same decision every morning when he got up and went back to being a Yoon. She thought about what it had cost her to learn Korean. Not the classes, not the study. She had done that before she ever met Junho. She had a gift for language, had always had it, had picked up her first Korean from a roommate in medical school and followed the thread because it interested her, because she was the kind of person who pulled on threads. By the time she and Junho had their first real conversation, she was already fluent, already reading, already dreaming in it sometimes when she was tired enough. She had never told him. She had never told anyone. Not because she was planning for something, not because she was calculating. Because she had walked into this family and understood within the first 30 minutes exactly what they thought of her, and she had made a decision, quiet, private, entirely her own, that she would not give them the satisfaction of knowing what she knew, that she would let them speak freely, would gather every word they said about her like evidence, and when the moment came, she would decide what to do with it. That moment had arrived last night over jjigae and bone-cold politeness. She had not planned the question about the recipe. It had simply been the most elegant thing available. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup in the stairwell sink, checked her pager. Trauma Bay in 4 minutes. A man had come off a motorcycle on the expressway and was arriving by ambulance with a pneumothorax and a broken clavicle, and probably several things they did not know about yet. That was her work. That was the thing she was certain of. She pushed open the stairwell door and walked back into the hospital. Behind her, through the vent, she heard Mihua say one more thing before the lounge door opened and the conversation ended. "She is a good doctor," Mihua said. "I have never disputed that. But good doctors are everywhere. There is only one Yoon family." Zara did not slow down. She had heard worse. She had heard worse in that same building, in that same voice, for 7 months. And she had gone back every Thursday anyway. And she had saved 412 beds worth of lives in the years since. And she had not once, let any of it touch the steadiness of her hands. She was not going to start now. But something had shifted. The dinner last night had shifted it. The word December had shifted it further. And as she pushed through the Trauma Bay doors and her team turned toward her with the focused attention of people who trusted her completely, Zara felt the thing that had been sitting still inside her for 2 years finally decide to move. 6 weeks. They had given themselves 6 weeks. She almost felt bad for them. She was still in the Trauma Bay at 9:43 that night when he found her. She had known he would come eventually. Junho was not a man who left things unresolved. Not in surgery, not in the boardroom, not in the careful architecture of his private life. He had spent 2 years maintaining a particular silence, and last night she had reached into that silence and pulled out its foundation, and he was not the kind of man who could simply rebuild in the dark and pretend the ground had not shifted. She was charting at the workstation in the corner when she heard his footsteps. She knew his walk. She had learned it the same way she had learned everything about him quietly, without announcement, adding each detail to the picture she was building of a man who was more than his family had made him and less than he allowed himself to be. He stopped in the doorway. The Trauma Bay was empty now, cleaned and reset, the overhead lights on half power. He was still in his surgical clothes. He had been in theater until at least 9. She had heard his name on the intercom twice in the late afternoon, and he had come here directly, which meant he had not stopped to think about whether this was a good idea. He had just come. That told her something. "I need to talk to you," he said. She did not look up from the chart. "You know where our house is." He stepped inside. Let the door close behind him. "I could not wait until the house," he said. She saved the chart, turned on the stool to face him, crossed her arms, not in hostility in the way of a woman who had learned to hold herself together through long, cold hours and was not going to stop now. He looked tired. Not the surface tiredness of a long shift, he was built for those. They both were. This was the tiredness that lived underneath. In the part of a person that had been performing steadiness for so long, the performance had started to cost something real. She recognized it because she had worn it herself for 2 years. "How long?" he said again. The same question as last night, but different now. Last night, it had been shock. Tonight, it was something that had been sitting with the question for 18 hours and had come out the other side of it needing the actual answer. 3 years, she said, before we met. He absorbed that. She watched him do it, watched the calculation move through him, the reordering of the timeline, every dinner and every phone call and every conversation his family had held in her presence being re-examined under this new light. His jaw tightened. "You never said anything." She tilted her head. "Neither did you." That landed. She saw it land. He did not look away from it, which she had expected, whatever else Junho Yoon was, he was not a man who flinched from consequences he had earned. You heard everything they said, he said. Every dinner. Every dinner, she confirmed. Every phone call that happened in rooms I was standing near. Every conversation your mother had in the family lounge on Thursday mornings at the hospital when she assumed I was busy saving lives and not standing in the stairwell with a coffee. Something crossed his face. Something she did not have a clean name for it was not quite shame and not quite grief and not quite the look of a man who was surprised. It was the look of a man who had known, somewhere deep and unacknowledged, that this was possible and had chosen not to examine it. Zara, he said. She held up her hand again. Not yet. She needed him to understand the full shape of it before he started building sentences. You know what they are planning. You know about December. You know about the Lim family dinner and the formal introduction and the conversation your mother has already decided ends before the new year. He was very still. She stood up. She was not tall, but she was precise, and in the half-lit trauma bay, with 2 years of silence finally burning off her like a fog, she was the most present thing in the room. I am not asking you to explain your family, she said. I have heard your family explain themselves for 3 years in a language they believed I did not speak. I do not need an explanation. The only thing I need from you right now is an answer to a different question. He looked at her steadily. Whatever you need to ask. She held his gaze. Do you want this marriage? She said. Not your family's version of it. Not the version that manages optics or satisfies obligations or produces an heir with the right surname. Do you, Junho Yoon, want to be married to me? The trauma bay was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the hospital continuing its work. A cart rolling down a corridor. A distant intercom. The low hum of the building doing what buildings did through the night. Inside, there was only the two of them and the question she had been building toward for 2 years, finally out in the open air, where it could not be avoided or rerouted or answered in any language except the one he had been refusing to use. He took one step toward her, then another. He stopped close enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to hold his eyes. Up close, in the dim light, he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had been walking toward for a very long time and was only now allowing himself to acknowledge the journey. Yes, he said. His voice was low and entirely steady. Yes, I want this marriage. I have wanted this marriage from the first month. I have been wanting it in every silence I chose, and every dinner I sat through, and every night I came home and did not say the things I should have said. She did not move. Then why? She said. Her voice was quiet too. Not broken. Zara did not break easily, but stripped down to the thing underneath. The real question. The one that had weight. Why did you let it go this far? Why did you sit at that table and say nothing while your mother called me an experiment in front of your father and your aunt and the woman she has already chosen to replace me? He exhaled. Because I am a coward, he said. The words came out flat and without self-pity, the way he would read a diagnosis to a patient who needed the truth more than they needed comfort. I told myself it was strategy, that I was waiting for the right moment, that confronting my family required preparation, positioning, that if I moved too early I would lose the leverage to protect you. He stopped. But the truth is, I was afraid. I have been afraid of my family my entire life in a way I have never been afraid of anything in an operating theater, and I chose that fear over you, and I am standing here now because I will not choose it again. Zara looked at him for a long moment. She was a doctor. She knew the difference between a man performing remorse and a man actually inside it. She knew what it looked like in the body, in the way a person held their shoulders, in whether their eyes moved when they spoke, in the specific quality of stillness that came from someone telling the truth about something that cost them to say. He was inside it. That did not fix anything. It did not return 2 years. It did not unsay what his mother had said or unhear what Zara had heard in 7 months of Thursday mornings in a cold stairwell. But it was real, and she had been dealing in the real for long enough to know the difference between a thing that could be built on and a thing that could not. She uncrossed her arms. Then do something about it, she said. She drove home alone. Junho had offered. She had told him she needed the 30 minutes, and he had nodded he was learning, or he was remembering that he already knew that she was not a woman who needed to be escorted through her own decisions. She had been making them alone long enough. She drove through the city and thought about her mother, who had told her once that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was convince herself that staying quiet was the same as being patient. Patience was a strategy. Silence was just silence. The two looked identical from the outside and felt completely different from the inside, and every woman eventually had to reckon with which one she had actually been practicing. Zara had been practicing both. The silence had been tactical. She was clear about that, had always been clear about that, had never confused her stillness for acceptance. She had been gathering, she had been building a picture. She had been waiting for the moment when what she knew would mean something, when the weight of it would actually land. Last night at the dinner table had been that moment. Tonight in the trauma bay had been the moment after it. She pulled into the garage and sat for a minute with the engine off. The house was lit. Junho must have left lights on before he came to the hospital, and it looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was supposed to be. A Yoon family residence. Quiet, expensive, correctly appointed. The kind of house that appeared in the background of photographs and never in the foreground, because the foreground was always a Yoon. She had lived in that background for 2 years. She was done with the background. She went inside. She showered. She changed into clean clothes and made herself tea and sat at the kitchen island and waited, because there was one more conversation that needed to happen before this could move, and it was not going to happen in a hospital or a car or a darkened entrance hall. Junho arrived 20 minutes later. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her sitting there, composed, waiting. He read the room the way surgeons read rooms quickly, completely, and he did not reach for small talk or deflection. He sat down across from her. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not going to fight for this marriage in the way your family expects me to fight. I am not going to beg. I am not going to make myself smaller or quieter or more palatable to people who decided before they ever met me that I was insufficient. I have spent 2 years being fluent in a language in this house and pretending I was not, and I am not going to spend a single day more performing ignorance for anyone's comfort." He was listening, completely. "If you want this marriage," she continued, "you are the one who has to say so, out loud, to your family. Not in a text, and not in a meeting you schedule 3 months from now, and not in a carefully worded letter drafted by a lawyer, to your mother. In the same room. In Korean, so there is no question about what was said, and no version of events that can be quietly revised afterward." He nodded slowly. She looked at him steadily. "I am a surgeon at one of the best hospitals in this city. I have rebuilt hearts that other doctors walked away from. I have worked 12-hour shifts on 3 hours of sleep, and I have never once lost my steadiness in a room that needed me steady. I do not need saving. I do not need defending. What I need is a husband who is willing to stand beside me and say so." Junho was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know what I need to do." She searched his face. "Tomorrow," he said. "Not a meeting, not a phone call. I will go to my mother's house, and I will say it directly, and I will not leave until it is understood." She held his eyes for a long moment. Then she nodded. She picked up her mug and took a slow sip, and in the quiet of the kitchen, with the city outside continuing its indifferent business, something between them settled into a new shape, still uncertain, still unfinished, but honest in a way it had not been before. That honesty felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in this house since the day she moved in. She would take it. He went the next morning. He did not ask her to come. She had not expected him to. This was his conversation to have, his family to face, his silence to answer for. She was not a prop in his reckoning. She was the reason for it, which was a different thing entirely. She went to work. She took 3 traumas before noon. She ate lunch in the break room and answered her residents' questions, and did not check her phone until 2 o'clock, which was longer than she had managed not to check it since the night she matched into her residency. He had texted at 11:47, "Coming home tonight. Bring dinner. We should eat together." That was all. She put her phone back in her pocket and stood at the break room window, looking at the city for a moment. The skyline was flat and gray with early winter clouds. The kind of sky that promised nothing and delivered what it wanted. She thought about Mihua's voice through the ventilation gap. This concludes before December. She thought about Yeonhee leaning across the table with her particular brand of academic certainty. She thought about Yoonho's father and his single, barely visible nod. She thought about what it had cost Junho to walk into that house this morning and say the thing he had been not saying for 2 years. She picked up her phone and texted back. Bring the soup from the place on Dongho Road, the one your mother hates. His reply came in 4 seconds. Done. She smiled. Just slightly. To herself, in the break room, with the gray city outside and her pager about to go off and the rest of her shift still ahead of her. That evening they sat across from each other at the kitchen island, with containers of doenjang jjigae from the small restaurant on Dongho Road, the one Mihwa had called common once, in Korean, while looking directly at Zara, and Junho told her what had happened. He had gone in the morning. His mother had been in her sitting room with tea already poured, which meant she had been expecting him, which meant she was not as surprised as she had perhaps wanted him to believe. He had sat down across from her. He had said, I know what you have been planning. I know about the Lim family dinner. And I know about December. And I know what you said at the hospital on Thursday mornings when you believed my wife did not understand Korean. His mother had gone very still. He had continued, My wife has spoken Korean for 3 years. She understood every word spoken at every dinner and every phone call and every conversation this family held in her presence in the belief that she could not follow it. She said nothing because she is a more patient person than any of us deserved. I am telling you this so that we are all operating with the same information going forward. And then he had said the thing that mattered. I am not dissolving this marriage. I am not attending a formal dinner with the Lim family. I am not continuing a conversation about replacing my wife with a more convenient option. Zara is my wife, and she will remain my wife. And if this family cannot find a way to treat her as such, then this family will see considerably less of me. Mihwa had not spoken for a long time. When she did, she had said only, You should have told me she spoke Korean. He had said, You should not have given her reason to stay silent. And then he had come home. Zara listened to all of it. She held her soup with both hands, and she listened, and when he was finished, she sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle. She knew this was not finished. Mihwa was not a woman who revised her position over a single morning conversation. The Lim family arrangement would need to be formally closed. There would be dinners that were colder for a while, and silences that had a different texture than before, and a long, slow process of a family learning to see a woman they had spent 2 years deliberately not seeing. It would not be easy, but Zara had never needed easy. She needed honest, and she needed standing beside, and she needed a husband who had finally, at the cost of a morning she could only imagine, chosen to be exactly that. She looked at him across the island. The soup from the place your mother hates, she said. Good choice. He looked at her. Something in his face opened, not the guarded, calculated expression she was used to in this kitchen, but something quieter and less protected. Something that had been waiting behind the stillness for a very long time. She told me once it was not the kind of thing a Yoon should eat, he said. Too ordinary, no occasion to it. He paused. I have been eating there every week for 3 years. Zara set down her spoon. She looked at her husband, this complicated, careful, finally honest man who had eaten ordinary soup in defiance of his family for 3 years and never mentioned it. Who had married her knowing everything his family would say, and had spent 2 years trying to hold both truths at once before last night had made that impossible. She thought about what it meant to hold something broken and not let it fall. She thought that sometimes the breaking was the point, that sometimes you had to let the thing collapse before you could see what it was actually made of. She reached across the island. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She put her hand on his, and he turned his palm up and held it. And outside the gray clouds had broken open, and the first real cold of the season was moving through the city, and inside the kitchen of the Yoon family house, their house, she had decided, hers as much as his 2 surgeons ate ordinary soup, and began, quietly and without ceremony, the long work of choosing each other properly. She understood everything. She always had. And in the end, that was not her weakness, it was the thing that gave her the patience to wait for him to catch up. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next on Ebony and Soul. Drop a comment and tell me, what was the moment you knew Junho was worth it? Or was it the soup?